So first of all, welcome. Before I start a little bit about who we as CIRCL are, so I'm working for an organization called CIRCL. We're basically the national CSIRT for the private sector of Luxembourg. We are basically there to build security for everything that is basically not government in Luxembourg. So that means private sector, communes, and so on. And yeah, that's basically where I hail from. One of our objectives at CIRCL is basically to build security for the private sector. So this involves a lot of various different efforts, and one of them is basically building open source tools. And MISP is one of the tools that we have been developing for a pretty long time. So we've been basically, on the one hand, leading the development of MISP for a long time. On the other hand, we have also been running several MISP communities out there. So one of our goals basically is to foster information sharing, to get organizations to, first of all, share information if they have something useful to share with the community, but also to basically get them to make use of the data that is being shared in the community in a more sensible way. So these are our objectives with MISP, basically. So in this regard, we're kind of eating our own dog food. So on the one hand, we're basically the developers of the tool, but on the other hand, we're also one of the biggest users of the tool itself as well. So that means that we have the luxury of walking over to our colleagues or colleagues coming up to us and slapping us on the back if something doesn't work as intended. So the idea with this presentation is to basically talk a little bit about some of our experiences with how the improvements in terms of maturity for our communities have basically prompted us to grow together with the needs of our community in terms of how to use data, what sort of data is relevant, and basically building tools that allows us to make data more actionable than it was before. So we're just going to go through some of those things. So before I start, a little bit about how MISP as a tool has evolved. So for those that don't know MISP at all, it's basically a threat information sharing platform. It's an open source tool, so anyone interested can just go out there, grab it, and start using it. Initially, our use case was very simplistic. We basically were a group of CIRTs that had that were trying to get to the bottom of some targeted attacks. And one of the things that we noticed early on was that we were basically duplicating a lot of work. So this was 2011-ish, which meant that communication for any technical data was basically emails, phone calls, and so on. So something completely unformalized at the time. So a guy called Christophe van de Pla decided to basically start the development of a small tool at the time that was called SIG, that was basically meant to solve this issue on a quick short-term basis, basically for basically introducing a platform that allowed malware reversers to share their output to basically avoid this duplication of work. So this was then later on adopted by several organizations, and more of us jumped on board on the development side and started to further develop it. And then the project became MISP. So this was 2012-ish. So to understand a little bit where we came from, we have to talk a little bit about the type of users that were involved in the entire process. So as mentioned before, initially it was just a group of malware reversers that wanted to solve their own issues. That meant that the tool was pretty limited to the scope that was needed for this group itself. So that means if you're working on the analysis process, you're grabbing certain points of data, and you want to share those with your partners along with the samples so that they can assist you and so that you can work together on it. That meant that our scope was basically purely collecting data, sharing the data, and perhaps using the data also for some defense afterwards. So this is where the security analysts became interested in the output of the reverse engineers. So the idea was, if you're already collecting this data and you can make it somewhat actionable for us, then we can start using it for detection, for blocking, and so on. Now, one of the interesting things with the security analysts becoming more and more interested in the tool itself and in joining the platform was they had their own needs of how they wanted to mold the platform and how they wanted to basically use the data that was in there. So one of the early improvements to MISP was basically the export system, meaning that we could feed various different tools out there with the data that was contained within. That meant if your reverse engineers basically got a lot of indicators out of their analysis, use that data by generating defensive rules for your IDSs, for your host intrusion detection systems, and so on and so forth. So this had an interesting side effect. The moment you start taking these indicators and putting it into your protective devices, you start getting output from those devices too. Detections are very interesting when it comes to gathering information about the modus operandi of an attacker and about basically the life cycle of the indicators that are contained within. So the moment you get sightings, you see something is still active, something is used in a recurring fashion. These are all interesting data points, especially for intelligence analysts. And those were the next group that kind of jumped on board. Now, it was a little bit weird. The organizations that we worked for at the time basically had this somewhat of a weird separation between those doing reverse engineering and more of the technical extraction of the information, and the threat intelligence team were kind of separate. And that meant that the communication between those teams was not as ingrained. One of the things that we've seen with the evolution of the maturity of our community, as well as with the tooling that we have, was basically that it brought these teams closer together. These teams are more ingrained with what they do and exchange information more rapidly because their work depends on one another's output. That means that, for example, if someone is more into reverse engineering, then knowing the tooling, the modus operandi of attackers and so on helps you in your process. On the other hand, the output of what you do feeds either directly or through the detection process your intelligence analysts. So we basically, within our own organizations, got all of these different groups involved, and they started to have their own output of what they were doing and sharing with the community out there. Now, some of the interesting things for us as a CSIRT was that we basically started to interact with more and more organizations that had their own security needs, that had their own security teams doing something similar, but that were primarily in a completely different business. So one of the first cases for that, I mean, we're in Luxembourg, so we're a country known to house quite a few banks. So that means the financial sector was one of the first ones that we interacted with in this regard, where they came to us and said, this is great. I mean, you guys have solved the issue for yourselves for information sharing, for your technical needs. We have some other needs that we would like to basically solve the same issue for. Can't you help us with that? And we figured, okay, that kind of makes sense. Why don't we in the first place? Why do we limit ourselves with what sort of information we're sharing? So we sat down with them and we said, okay, what sort of information are you interested in sharing in the first place? And they told us that they have fraud teams that are basically tracking information on mule accounts and all sorts of malicious financial activity. And we said, okay, just describe to us what exactly you're sharing and we can just change the data model. I mean, it's basically our tool, so we can do whatever. And we'll make sure that you can share that data too. So there we saw something completely interesting because we started getting groups engaged in the sharing that we didn't think had any interest in it in the first place. So we started reaching out to other communities out there. So afterwards we got law enforcement, border control, and so on interested. And now we have a very diverse sharing community with MISP, and meaning that different sharing communities out there. So these are not necessarily interconnected with one another, but a very diverse user base in general. So we had both vertical growth within our own organization and the horizontal in terms of reaching out to other types of sectors out there. Another thing that became more and more interesting, and one of the more important aspects that I'm going to be talking about this entire presentation will be the contextualization of information, was that all the context that started getting shared along with the data as the maturity grew of our communities allowed us to basically gather statistics out of the data that was being shared. And that was more interesting for risk analysis teams. For example, which attacker techniques are on the rise? What should we be preparing our clients for when we're dealing with different risks that they're facing? So it was an interesting growth over time. So just to go back to the initial scope of MISP, it was very straightforward. What we wanted to do was extract information during the analysis process, store it in MISP, correlate it with existing data. So that was one of the first functionalities that was there. I want to see if something that I'm dealing with has already been seen before by my community. Share it with partners, and then basically just use the data that I've received and that I've generated myself to feed my various different tools. Initially, this was very low scope with only a few formats supported. So this was basically our basic diagram of how we dealt with MISP initially. This was the initial use case. And as you can see, we're horrible with design in general, so this graph is a testament to that. So sorry about that. But the idea was that it was very simplistic. Now, one of the things that that prompted us to basically introduce more context and to work more with the threat intelligence side than just the raw data side of things was basically several things that happened over time. One of them was the capabilities to extract data have improved tremendously over time. So that means that if you're dealing with automated tooling, if you're looking at, for example, sandboxing tools nowadays, the amount of data that they gather around the attacker techniques themselves while something is being executed is already way higher than it was before. So that is one example of how our methods of extraction have improved. On the other hand, utilizing this information has improved tremendously too. That meant that when we have this data already in our hands, if we have the context to it, we can actually make use of it. Before, what we used to do, we would take all the indicators that were shared in our community and just dump it into our IDS and hope that we don't get too many alerts. And if we did, we probably just hit someone on the hand telling them not to share false positives with us. So that was a very simplistic solution that didn't really scale, especially if you're dealing with larger communities out there. Another thing that, that changed over time was the willingness to share. Initially, we had a lot of pushback from a lot of organizations saying, okay, we are afraid of sharing anything. It could go wrong for us if we do. Now, the end result was that, that's probably not a nice way to put it, but thanks to situations that popped up in a bunch of different organizations where they were hit by something that they could have avoided if their partners would have shared information with them, we basically started seeing more and more willingness to share information over time. So this was a very slow and organic growth over the past few years. Another thing that was interesting was basically, initially, as mentioned, there was this kind of lack of cooperation between the different types of teams doing the technical analysis in a silo versus the threat intelligence teams doing their things in a silo with very little communication besides weekly briefings and so on between them. So this is also something that changed over time. So basically, the more we saw this growth in maturity, we had to adapt with the tool itself. So we've gone through quite a few changes over time. I mean, when we're looking at the different needs of the different communities, we basically had to analyze a lot of different aspects of the data that was being shared. What were the things that were basically blocking for us? One of the biggest issues that popped up, and even though it's in weird order, I'll start with that one, is basically false positive management. One of the first things we got as feedback when we started sharing information was, okay, we're getting false positives in here and we can't really do much with it. We needed to solve that somehow. That was one of the issues. Another thing was we basically had to deal with a lot of data and we had to prioritize the information. That was already tough. We had different reasons for prioritizing. One of them was basically technical limitations. Very often when you're dealing with a lot of data and you're dealing with protective tools, you simply don't have the means to keep track of everything. Very often also the data that was lower priority was just not interesting for certain aspects. So when you're dealing with a community where some parts of the community are blocking on the data that they receive, some parts are using it for detection, and some parts for long-term analysis, you have very different needs on what data you're interested in the first place. And we basically had to find a way to sub-select the data and to really massage the data for each individual use case. So one of the things that we usually say in this regard is we're being very lax with what we accept in terms of data, but we're very strict with what we emit depending on the tool that we're feeding. Okay? So one of the first things that we tried to do basically to solve these issues was to introduce a system that would allow us to contextualize it in a very simplistic way. So the idea was we should take any data point that exists in MISP, so, and be able to attach context to it. Our initial thought was a little bit naive perhaps with this, because one of the things we wanted to do was we wanted to look at the different aspects of what might be interesting about data points and just normalize it all. So we had this great idea where we would put everything into values of 0 to 100 depending on the aspects that made sense to us, and we kind of proposed it to some organizations. Where immediately we got some really weird feedback that made a lot of sense. For example, that our use case doesn't match theirs. So what we think is important context is not important to them. They have completely different needs, especially the moment you leave your own sector and you go to a different sector and you're talking to people there, it's completely out of scope what you're doing. So that was one of the things. So we had to be more generic. And then the other issue was that when we had this naive idea at first that we could just go to an organization and say, here is a naming convention that we think you should use for this specific part of contextualization, please use that. And then they said, great, we've been using this other thing for 50 years, we're not going to change it for you. And they had a point. So we basically said this wouldn't really work. And then we also had a massive amount of discussions about how to map certain vocabularies to numeric values. And those were heated discussions. In some cases, it's kind of straightforward. In some cases, not at all. And massive arguments about how we should be doing it in the first place. So then we had a different idea. How about we just allow everyone to tag data the way they want? So just put labels on everything the way that you want. We actually ended up with an implementation for this. So we had this free tagging system in MISP for a while, and it was an utter disaster. Human creativity knows no bounds. We've seen at least 7 different ways of spelling TLP Amber. The moment you want to use this for any automation, no, that just doesn't work. So we figured, okay, we've done something horribly wrong here. Let's go back and think of something else. So the first system that we had in place that actually worked well for us for contextualization, it was a very simplistic system, is what we call the MISP taxonomy system. And that is still there today. These are basically machine tag labels that are coming from set vocabularies that are prepared by communities, shared by communities, and reusable by others. So this meant that we still had the flexibility to be able to describe our own nomenclatures without being tied to, for example, a committee or a vendor or someone else having to go through the process of deciding whether they agree with us or not, so everyone can create their own. But after you've created a vocabulary, it can be shared with your peers, and your peers can reuse the exact same format that you have used before. So that meant that we had both the flexibility somewhat, and both the ability to use it for filtering. So we ended up with a system where we use a triple tag format. It's very straightforward. We basically have a namespace that basically describes what vocabulary we're dealing with in the first place. Then we have a predicate that defines the aspect that we are describing. And then each of those tags had a value, which was the actual value within that predicate. Each of these tags could also potentially have a numeric value assigned. So in some cases, when you're dealing with contextualization, you do want to have a gradient scale, basically. And in those cases, we could do it. But the idea was to keep it simple and keep it outside of the tool. This was very important for us. Initially, when we had hard-coded all of the different contextualization data points, users would have to go and modify a massive piece of software just to get their vocabularies in there. That didn't work. Nobody bothered to do that, really. And when they did, it didn't end well normally. So instead, what we wanted to do, simple JSON structures for the libraries. Let's reuse those for everything. Nowadays, I mean, it's been a pretty popular structure. We have over 100 taxonomies that have been contributed by the community, ranging from very small use case taxonomies to basically translations of big frameworks out there and so on. But one of the things that we were missing at this point was taxonomies were great when you wanted to define and contextualize data with something that was obviously known. For example, there was a mention of TLP today. TLP is pretty obvious and universally known. So if you're saying TLP Amber, it's quite straightforward. On the other hand, when you started having organizations encoding threat actor information, for example, and using a specific name for a threat actor that they use internally, and tagging data with that, that was not obvious at all for others. So when they received that data, I had no idea what to do with this. So instead, what we tried to do was have an alternate system next to taxonomies where we could elaborate on the contents of the tag itself. So we came up with this system that is perhaps a little bit weirdly named called MISP Galaxies that allow us to attach knowledge base items to individual data points. It works the same way as taxonomy, so it's just something that you attach as a label to anything out there. It comes from a common vocabulary that is shared via the open source and via private means, depending on whether you want to share it with everyone or not. And then it can be used to label data. So This allowed us to basically be pretty flexible with how much data we want to put in each of these labels, and it allowed us to do filtering on that. So we basically had to consider a lot of different aspects of the contextualization itself. Initially, when we started out, most of the context was very straightforward. For example, information about what you can do with the data is a typical one. TLP, whether you can do active research or something. So these were the initial points of contextualization that we had. But then one of the things that became more and more interesting was describing how much we trust the data. So if we're getting data from a private source, for example, that we're allowed to share, how much do we trust the source? How much does this source claim to trust the data itself? These were all data points that we wanted to encode. When you're making decisions on what sort of data to block on, what sort of data to detect on, or if your analysts are making decisions on how much it is an accepted answer that they're seeing there, then you basically want to have this information encoded as well. Something else that was interesting is describing why information is relevant to us. That means if I'm getting any data and if I'm just getting a list of IP addresses in, I have no idea whether that's interesting for me or not. I don't know what to do with that from the get-go. However, if we're describing via these different contextualization libraries why that would be relevant to me, what context this was used in, then suddenly it becomes interesting. The other thing is describing who is behind an attack, and we are not in the business of basically trying to find the actual threat actors behind something. We're trying to make our own lives easier for detection and for the analysis. That means if we assume that there is a group behind different attack and we kind of know what sort of patterns those attackers use, that just makes our lives easier. So we don't want to basically attach these data points to data to claim that it's 100% surefire thing. It's just to make our own lives easier. But for that, we had to find a way to basically describe the different groupings behind different data points and also different toolings used behind it. Motivation was another interesting thing. When you're dealing with, for example, trying to do risk analysis on who might be affected by something, you first of all have to kind of consider the motivation. Why are they targeting the victims that they're targeting in the first place? Is it for monetary gain? Is it basically a political campaign? What are we dealing with here? And that already gives you a lot of hints on how to proceed further. Who should take more care of these attacks and so on. Then something that has popped up more recently, more frequently in the data that we're seeing shared is really dealing with the remediation and the detection factor of the data. One of the things that has been an absolutely great asset in our community from what we've seen was basically the sharing of supporting tools. That means if an organization has spent time to thwart a threat, and they've basically developed their own scripts to detect it, to remediate it, and so on. Sharing that along with the data is really useful, especially when it comes to lower maturity organizations out there. So this was another point of contextualization that we've seen more and more growth of. So we generally recommend organizations to kind of consider these different elements out there. One of the things that hasn't been used that much yet in the communities that we know of, but that there is obviously a need for, is discussing the impact of the different attacks. So that means both from a monetary perspective to also a technical perspective. What is the impact of this attack being successful? Can you share that information as well? This, of course, very often has a very high sensitivity. So that means that this will not be shared on very broad communities, probably at first, unless it's going into generic metrics. But that's fine too. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls that we ran into early on. One of them was false positive handling, and this was super frustrating for us at start. Initially, when we started out with MISP, we were just a bunch of organizations, not that many, a dozen perhaps, that were basically exchanging information. But even in such a small community, you always had some groups that were basically putting in a lot less effort to vetting the data, which depended on the available time they had, their maturity, their tooling, and so on. And very often we ended up with someone giving us a call saying, okay, there's this organization, they have just pushed google.com as an indicator again, can you please kick them out of the community? And when you're getting requests like that, you're thinking, okay, there is something wrong here. This shouldn't be up to whoever is encoding the data to know that this is obviously something, a mistake. I mean, we look at it as analysts and we see, okay, this is obviously a false positive. We know that. So we figured, let's consider how we can encode this information and basically have the system filter this out for us. Now, we don't want to filter it out on ingestion, because sharing with your partners that this malware is reaching out to google.com every 30 seconds is valuable information. That doesn't mean that your detection team should use google.com as an indicator. But if for an analyst, it's still interesting information. So because of that, one of the things that we wanted to do, and to avoid this whole alert fatigue that can come from all these false positives, was to introduce a community-driven effort that was basically a bunch of libraries that identified those very common false positives that could end up in there. So this meant basically known public DNS resolvers, top 1,000 domains, and a bunch of different lists like these. So right now, these systems are in MISP, but they are not used by default. So we still get these questions every now and then, especially when organizations are starting out, is why do I get these false positives in my SIEM? The answer is you have to enable this system basically that basically on-demand filters the data out when you're requesting data from MISP. So we still don't want to remove anything that's in there, just on the export level. So we call the system the warning list system. Again, it's a JSON-driven tool. The idea is that we have this community effort with all the shared libraries out there that anyone can reuse. But in some cases, organizations are building their own that is basically alerting them if something in their own infrastructure is about to be used as an indicator, for example, and shared out there. So there are different use cases for this that range from the more public ones to the private ones. Another issue that we faced early on was basically all the data that we shared on a technical level was basically flat individual values with some minor context around it. That means if you're describing a file has a bunch of different data points that you might want to share. And when you're just throwing all those data points in a container, and then it gets really difficult to understand what you're actually dealing with here in this whole jungle of different values. So we figured we need a system that is easily templatable, where you can create containers for more complex structures. So we came up with a system called MISP Objects. This is a templating system that allows you to basically generate your own templates based on the basic building blocks of MISP, where you can describe these more complex structures. One of our challenges there was that these templates should not have to be known by the other side when you're sharing data with them, so they should still be able to understand the resulting data without being able to reproduce something similar due to the lack of the template itself. Okay. So basically, this is just a small explanation of what it looks like. We basically have our individual data points that we encapsulate in one of these objects. So this is basically a financial fraud event small snippet. It's basically a bank account object with some metadata around it. And one of the things that we wanted to do is being able to tie these different objects together and tell a story of what happened. So this is part of a campaign that had to deal with the CEO fraud, if I remember correctly, where basically the same bank accounts and the same bank especially kept popping up over several different campaigns that we started correlating on. So this is just an idea of how you can take these more different diverging object types from our usual use case and still get a lot of use out of it if you're in that business. So besides this whole solving this issue of more complex data structures, one of the things that we were still missing was this whole feedback loop. So we basically got all of these data points in the system. They were going to our detection systems, but we still had an issue with any lifecycle management when it came to our data. I mean, if we have all this data there, they are kind of frozen in time. When it was created, that's the timestamp that we have for each of the data points. But that data point's relevance over time increases if it has a recurring observance in our community. If it doesn't, it becomes less and less interesting. For example, IP addresses that are stale, that are not showing up as indicators anymore, you're rotating out from your working set. If it is still being actively abused, then you still want to keep it in your active working set. So we wanted to have a simplistic system that allows us to say, when something was seen again in the community, by what sort of a tool it was seen. So we captured all these different points in our citing system. We were pretty happy with how we could use this basically to show the life cycle of threat actors, of different tools used based on the individual data points that were tagged with that data using the tagging and the Galaxy system, and that received sightings over time. But one of the things that we were missing was it was still super clumsy to use for automation. That meant you had these different data structures in the system, and there was no easy way to kind of tie it together. But we'll get back to that later on, how we ended up working with that. So the system was very straightforward. Via the UI, you could basically say, okay, I've seen it too. If you wanted to be a UI user, almost nobody ever used the UI for this, so you usually use tools for it. So there's an API where you can set a timestamp, set a source, and set a reason for why you're posting the citing. So one of the things that we were missing whilst adding all of these different subsystems was, okay, how do we basically make use of this? So we have all this metadata now. People are actually starting to contextualize the data. How can we actually use it for our detection, for our protective needs? So the first thing we did was basically revamp the entire API system that we had. So if anyone here used MISP's API a long time ago, just try to wipe those times from your memory. They're times we don't want to remember anymore. So now we have a bunch of simplistic but very tunable APIs where you can basically use a bunch of these different context data points for tuning your data set. That means that if we're feeding different tools, we usually use very different queries against MISP for getting the data set that we're actually interested in. So for example, I would use a completely different data set from my MISP when it comes to detection than I would for blocking. I would take, for example, the reliability of the source and the information much more into account when it comes to blocking, because it's much more fatal, basically, if I make a mistake there and start blocking data for my users that are false positives. Also, when it comes to basically dealing with individual threats and doing research into individual threats, you really want to get everything that is related to that threat alone without getting all the clutter around it. So this was one of the goals that we had with the system. So here's a very small example. All of our APIs except JSON objects. So it's pretty straightforward. You basically tell the tool what format you want to get your data returned in. You basically tell it whether you want to enforce that warning list system that removes all the obvious false positives from the system or not, depending on your use case. And then you can start using tags, the organizations, the types of the individual data points as filters that you can basically build more complex queries out of. So here's a very small example. I'm interested in anything that is not TLP white or OSINT because that data I get from different sources, for example, anyway. But I'm interested in anything related to sophisty targeting the chemical sector. It's just an example. So this would be a pretty basic query. Okay. So the other thing that we wanted to do with the system was when it comes to feeding the various different tools, we're a small CSIRT. We definitely don't have the resources to get access to every proprietary tool out there, so we definitely cannot build connectors for everything. So one of the things we wanted to do, we wanted to make the integration as simple as possible, so you can basically inject your own libraries into the export system. So this net filter export, for example, was written as part of a training, so we just wrote it there on the spot. It's very straightforward to write your own export filters. When it comes to decision-making with the data, one of the things we also wanted to do is use this context to decide where we can transfer data to. For example, being able to decide who I'm going to push data to based on context instead of whatever was decided by the data's creator allowed this whole ISAC use case where you had organizations that decided the flow of data between their different organizations. So we had more and more of a need where organizations would gather data from a lot of different sources, decide what made sense for the constituency, and then only allow the data to be routed on that made sense for them. So these filters helped us achieve that. The other thing that you sometimes had was you connected to a new community, you found a bunch of different data that you were interested in, and even more that you were not interested in. In that case, you created some filters that told MISP what sort of data you're interested in based on the context, and to just pull those into your own community. Okay. So one of the probably best things to happen to information sharing over the past few years was MITRE's attack framework. So I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with it, so I won't go too deeply into what it is. If not, I highly recommend you to spend some time with it. It's an absolutely fantastic framework that allows us to, on a very high level, standardize on the attacker techniques, which is absolutely great, because the moment that you're looking at data that we share in MISP, you basically have to deal with a lot of technical indicators and so on that a lot of people are not that interested in. They're more interested in what sort of attacks are we seeing in our community in the first place. And this is where attack for us was absolutely fantastic. The moment you start attaching the attacker techniques to each individual attack, that moment you can basically gather statistics out of your individual community of what sort of attack patterns are on the rise. When a new attack comes in and you want to basically show it to your risk analyst team, they won't be interested about what IP addresses were shared, what hashes were shared. They're interested in, okay, is this another spear phishing attack? How did this whole thing start? What are we looking for here? And those things are showing up very nicely on the attack framework. So one of the things that we did was basically incorporate this familiar attack navigator into MISP that allows us to both build the heat maps and also select those individual patterns when you're encoding data. So the good thing was users were already familiar with it. And the other interesting development from that we've seen was a bunch of organizations started building similar frameworks that were using the exact same concept but describing very different facets of information sharing. For example, we had the first one that popped up was called Attack for Fraud. It was presented at first CTI in London, if I remember correctly. It's by a chap from ING. He basically took his fraud attack patterns and encoded it into an attack-like matrix. And we said, this is great. Let's capture that to directly in MISP so that people can use it in the same way, get the same heat map statistics and so on out of it. We've seen the same recently pop up with election guidelines from by the NIS cooperation group. So we're seeing more and more of these pop up. They're absolutely fantastic. So if you're interested in designing a framework for your own sector, this is a really good way to do it. Another thing that we wanted to do was to be able to use the attack matrix representation of the data to basically be able to select sections of our data set and get the techniques out of that in a very easy way. So here's a small example. We basically do a search against our API. We want an attack matrix as a response, and we basically set a time frame, and we set a sector targeted. So that's just a very small example for a query that you can run, and the result will be a heat map like this that basically shows what sort of attack patterns were used over the past 365 days based on the data that you have gathered in your community with those filters that you've set. It also allowed us to start working on a bunch of different metrics and dashboarding tools. So basically all this contextualization started giving a whole new dimension to the data that we had. And for our risk analyst teams and so on, this was fantastic that they could basically see, okay, these are the patterns that are on the rise. These are the different points of context that we should be interested in. Okay. So once we were done with all of these different systems, we still felt that we were missing something. We had all these sightings there that were still unused, as I mentioned before. So via the API for filtering, they were not really great. And we still wanted to have a system where you don't make a decision on every individual export, so you don't basically set the rules each time you're exporting data, but instead a system that, based on certain rules, calculated scores for you for the individual indicators. So we started out with a research project. This was over 2 years ago. We ended up with a total of 3 published papers on this topic, where we were working with different approaches on how we could tackle this issue with the different data points that we had at hand. And we ended up with something that kind of made sense for us, that we already figured, okay, this is a good first iteration, and we ended up with an implementation based on that. So this system basically takes into, calculates a score for each individual value or indicator in MISP, based on a base score that is derived from the model. So the model basically takes into account what type of an attribute we're dealing with. So for example, IP addresses and hashes will have a very different starting and decay rate. And then we basically had a decay involved that was calculated based on a bunch of different metrics on how fast the value should deflate, which is then refreshed by sightings over time. So that means that if something is still seen, this decay rate is negated for a short period of time. And the other idea was to take the contextualization into account. So that goes into the model as well. Basically, if we have a model that says we take the Admiralty scale contextualization into account, then these are the weights that we are assigning to each individual point of context based on its value and based on its place in the model. So the end result was that that the model calculated a score between 0 and 100 based on the current point in time, based on the sightings that came in, and based on all of these different context fields that were encoded. You could load several models and write your own models with the system. So the way it works when using MISP is you basically end up with the different models that are enabled, showing you a score on the right side for each of the individual values. So here we see a bunch of IP addresses, so this is just mock data. And on the right side, we see that, for example, for our NIDS model, we get this score based on all of these different metrics taken into account. When it comes to the API, we also suddenly start getting these scores along with the data when we're querying the data in our own native format. So we start getting the decay score and some metadata about the model itself, which model produced that score, and we can use this for filtering. So the idea is that that we should be able to say, okay, when I'm dealing with my IDS, I want to use the NIDS model, and I want to set a threshold of 70 points as a cutoff for what I'm feeding to this specific tool. So for the models themselves, you have a bunch of different parameters. So on the one hand, you can define globally for the model itself what the default lifetime decay rate and so on should be. And then you can have individual overrides for the different types and for the different context points. Okay. So you also get some modeling tools that you can play with. So the idea is that if you're encoding your own model, you should be able to kind of test it with a graph and see, okay, how would my different indicators evolve over time if I use this model for this type, if I would change the decay rate somewhat, and so on. So the idea is that we wanted to leave it up to users to basically define their own models, but we provide some models as a basis, basically, for users to start working. So this system is not replacing all the other ones that I've mentioned before. This is coming in addition, and it's completely optional to use. Okay? So this is a small example of how we basically can set the individual taxonomies as an additional input for each of the values. So here we see, for example, in this example, that priority level has a pretty large weight when we use that taxonomy. Source reliability and information credibility have a pretty high weight as well, and the other ones are ignored in this case that are listed. And then based on this model, we can then start calculating our values for each of our data points. Again, going back to sightings, this is something that is popping up more and more in our communities. Initially, there was a massive pushback against providing sightings, but nowadays organizations are more prone to just say, okay, we have also seen this in our network. We're okay with sharing that information because we're seeing the value of getting this also from our peers if they see that we're sharing it too. And we use the sightings basically to just refresh the values to the original base score of each individual indicator when the sighting comes in. Okay. So as a small example of how you can basically query your system with this, so we've seen that query before where we basically told MISP to use these tags or these taxonomy tags as filters. Here's another example using a specific model that we have encoded. So this is our model with the ID of 85, and we're setting a threshold of 30 points for our return data. So we can use this in addition to all the other systems that we've already had before in MISP. The way forward with this is basically we're going to start incorporating some other metrics in there. One of the things that we're discussing is also incorporating third-party reputation services optionally. So if you have reputation services and if you're signed up to them, to incorporate those into this decaving value as well as one of the components. So again, we have all those different contextualization points that we use as part of the formula, and you should be able to inject external services into that as well. This is still in its infancy, this system. So if anyone is a MISP user out there, please give it a go, see if it matches your needs, see if there is anything that we should improve on it. I mean, it's our first implementation, and I'm sure that a lot of people will have better ideas than us in many aspects, so please let us know about them if you have anything to add to these. And that's basically it for the talk, so thank you all.
Thank you very much. Okay. I have to admit, I'm one of those people who haven't actually tried MISP hands-on yet. And I think I got a much better understanding of the idea behind some of the stuff that you built in there. So now maybe if I go and try it, I can understand how you've been thinking. We have tried the phone thingy with questions and stuff. Did anyone actually text a question?
No.
No. So, there you go. Do any of you have any questions? I see a hand at the back there. Okay. I'm going to try not to kill anyone.
Nice.
Whoa. Okay. Thank you. You got to activate the football thing.
Just shout.
What is your question?
And then repeat the question so they get it on video.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that the use cases for MISP has evolved over the time. What do you see the next big thing for MISP being out in the future?
So the question, just to repeat for those of you who didn't hear, the question is, what's the next big development step, the next big thing for MISP in the future?
Right. So we have different ideas on which way to move. I mean, one of the tricky ones that we're struggling with now is basically ensuring that different types of organizations start communicating more. So that is one of the trickiest ones that we're dealing with. Initially, we had this whole issue of individual people working in silos, and now we're seeing the same thing on a larger scale. We have seen incredible efforts from different ISACs and so on that popped up that basically created these information sharing communities out there. But one of the things that we're seeing is kind of a pushback against hooking these various communities up there. Now, this might also be, and one of the things that we're kind of struggling with in that regard, that very often the data that we're sharing between these communities is extremely detailed. That doesn't make that much sense when you're dealing with a completely different community that has completely different scopes of what they're looking at. So we're kind of trying to have a more simplified way of looking at the data. So Attack has been great for that in itself, to basically say we're not just sharing the technical information together with the metadata, but we can also just have a view just on the metadata itself to tell a story. So that's one of the things. And the other is, I mean, there is a constant flow of different aspects of information sharing showing up. If someone would have told me a few years ago that cryptocurrency information sharing would be important, I would have just laughed and said, okay, yeah, sure. So basically one of the things that we're dealing with from a day-to-day is these new things popping up. And organizations coming to us saying, okay, we have a completely different need here. So one of the things that popped up recently in MISP and that is completely weird for us is, for example, climate information sharing. That is completely not our use case, but it is also something that popped up. So one of the things we want to do is get more of these different types of organizations to share, and then whatever is relevant and an overlap between these different communities should be easily digestible. So I hope that somewhat answers it.
Nice.
Sharing is caring.
Exactly.
Okay, so apparently no more football. But are any more questions? I see a question in the middle there. I'm not going to try to throw this mic.
Yeah, Yeah, you seem to be taking a very algorithmical approach to calculating all the scores. And I was wondering, have you done comparisons with machine learning approaches to, yeah. You haven't mentioned that much, but you seem to have a lot of data to
that's a
build models.
very good question. I mean, we have been approached by some organizations that asked us the same thing. We haven't worked together with organizations that are deeply into machine learning yet. But if you know such an organization, or you are part of such an organization, you want to work with us in that, I'd be very interested to talk about that. Yeah.
There will definitely be a few more presentations on machine learning throughout the day,
Okay,
so that will be
that's great.
exciting. Yeah.
So any other questions? There is one there. Oh.
Okay, so the question is very good, so thank you for that. It's indeed something that is an issue. One of the things that we've seen, especially when it comes to very mixed communities, so when it comes to MISP, basically everyone can run their own community, and the width and breadth of their community depends on who they're willing to interconnect with. So in some cases, you have very close communities. In those cases, this is not really an issue, because they just decide these are the vocabularies that we're using. On large sharing communities, this indeed becomes tricky. So we basically now have an effort to kind of find mappings between the different taxonomies out there, but those mappings are sometimes very, yeah. So that is indeed tricky. So right now what we do is we basically have to deal with this on a consumer side. So that means if I'm querying my data set and I know that my community is using two alternate ways to describe the same concept, I have to use both in my query basically to get the full data set. So this is indeed something that we're struggling with. Again, in our case, we're running a very broad private sector sharing community in addition to the other ones that we run. And in that one, it's more of an issue because you're getting all sorts of different organizations sharing that are using wildly different vocabularies. And especially when you're dealing with military sector, private sector, NGOs, and so on, then it's going to be a completely misaligned system. So that's something that, yeah, is tough to deal with. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay, so whether we've already investigated using the metadata itself as data, basically, if I understood correctly. Yes, I mean, we do. In many cases, we don't care as much about the technical data itself, but we care more about the metadata that is being shared. So again, the contextualization itself reveals a completely different aspect to the information. So the indicators themselves are very useful when it comes to immediate blocking and for doing long-term research into, for example, threat actor infrastructure usage. But when it comes to actually investigating what sort of threats I'm actually dealing with and what I should be countering, then I'm looking more at the metadata itself and against at the taxonomies. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think that was the last question that we have time for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for coming and helping out.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.